Chapter 1. "You make sure you pick me up at quittin' time," Nadine's father said as his truck bounced through the gravel lot of Monroe Sawmill where he worked. He parked in the shade of the barking shed, twisted his wrist, and yanked the key from the ignition of his old Ford pickup. The engine shuddered and died, and he handed the key to his daughter. "I won't be late," Nadine promised. His father winked at her. "That's my gal." Nadine's fingers curled over the collar of her father's dog, Bonanza, who lunged for the door and whined as George Powell climbed out of the cab and walked toward the office where he'd punch in before taking his shift in one of the open sheds. "Hold on a minute," she told the anxious shepherd. "We'll be home soon." Thinking of the Powells' rented house caused a hard knot to form in her stomach. Home hadn't been the haven it had once been, and the chords of discontent in her parents' marriage had, in the past months, become louder. Sometimes Nadine felt as if she were stranded in the middle of a battlefield with nowhere to turn. Every time she opened her mouth to speak, it was as if she were stepping on a verbal and emotional minefield. Squinting through the dusty windshield, she tried not to think of life back at the house by the river, concentrating instead on the activity in the yard of the mill. Trailer trucks rolled through huge chain-link gates, bringing in load after load of branchless fir trees, and a gigantic crane moved the loads to the already monstrous piles in the yard. Still other cranes plucked some of the logs from the river to stack them into piles to dry. Men in hard hats shouted and gestured as to the placement of each load. One by one the logs were sorted, their bark peeled, and the naked wood squared off before it was finally sawed into rough-cut lumber, which was stacked according to grade and size. Her father had been a sawmill man all his life, and had often told her of the process of taking a single tree from the forest and converting it into lumber, plywood, chipboard, bark dust, and, in some cases, paper. George Powell was proud of the fact that he came from a long line of sawmill men. His father had worked in this very mill, as had his grandfather. As long as there had been Monroe Sawmill Company in Gold Creek, a Powell had been on the payroll. From the corner of her eye, Nadine saw a car roll into the lot, a sleek navy blue convertible. So shiny that the finish looked wet as it glinted in the sunlight, the Mercedes was visibly out of place in an assemblage of old pickups and dusty cars. The sports car looked like a thoroughbred sorted into a field of plow horses by mistake. Nadine slid over to the driver's side of the truck and, while petting Bonanza, studied the driver as he stretched out of the leather interior. He was tall, but young, probably not yet 20, with thick, coffee-colored hair that had been ruffled in the wind. His eyes were hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, and he slung a leather jacket over his shoulder. Nadine bit her lip. She didn't have to guess who he was. Hayden Gareth Monroe IV, son of the owner of the mill. She'd seen him years before when she was still a student in Gold Creek Elementary. He'd lived here for a short time, the only son of rich parents. His first cousins were the Fitzpatricks, who owned the logging company that supplied most of the trees for this milling operation. The Monroes and Fitzpatricks, thick as thieves, her mother had often said. Between the two families, they owned just about everything in Gold Creek. Nadine remembered Hayden as a 12-year-old boy, not as an angry young man, but now he appeared furious. His strides were stiff and long, his jaw set, his mouth a thin line of determination. He glared straight ahead, not glancing left or right, and he took the 2 steps to the sawmill's office as if they were one. He stormed into the small company office and the door slammed shut behind him. Nadine's breath felt hot and caught in her lungs. She pitied whoever was the object of his obvious wrath. Fury seemed to radiate off him like the heat rising off the ground. Suddenly she wished she knew more about him. But her memories of the Monroes and their only son, the Prince, as her brother Ben had referred to him, were vague. She was pretty sure that the Monroes had moved to San Francisco about the time Hayden was ready to start high school, and they only returned in the summer to live in their